for scraps of love. My daughter poured something into my late husband's crystal wine glass, and she thought I didn't see her do it. 3 seconds later, before she turned back around, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I heard her lean toward her husband and whisper 5 words that changed everything. "The medicine is working." I did not react. I did not gasp. I picked up my napkin, folded it once, of begging for scraps of love, and set it back down exactly where it had been. Because 38 years behind a pharmacy counter teaches you one thing above all else: never let the person holding the syringe see your hand shake. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What she didn't know was that I had already switched our glasses 40 minutes earlier in the kitchen while she was busy arranging deviled eggs on Walter's mother's china. Welcome back to Alpha Mom Stories. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the place where mothers tell you what really happens behind closed doors after the guests go home and the smiles come off. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe of Begging for Scraps of Love. Because what I'm about to tell you is a story about a woman who spent 40 years reading labels for a living, and how that one skill was the only thing standing between her and a very quiet, very legal disappearance. Of begging for scraps of love. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 69 years old. And for 38 of those years, I stood behind a pharmacy counter in the same small town, counting pills into amber bottles, checking interactions. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, catching the mistakes doctors were too rushed to catch themselves. I retired 4 years ago with a plaque that says 40,000 prescriptions filled without a single reportable error. Of begging for scraps of love, which is a strange thing to be proud of, but I am. My late husband Walter used to say I had 2 kinds of vision. I could look at a pill and tell you what it was worth on a shelf. Of begging for scraps of love, and I could look at a person and tell you what was actually wrong with them, which was very often not what they'd come in complaining about. He said it like a joke. It wasn't a joke. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was the thing that saved my life 3 weeks ago, and I didn't even know I still had it in me until the night my daughter handed me a glass of wine that smelled almost right, but not quite. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I need you to understand something before I go any further, because it's the whole reason nobody in my family saw this coming, including me. I didn't build my career out of ambition. Is of begging for scraps of love. I built it because Walter was gone 8 months after his diagnosis, and I had 3 children and a mortgage and exactly one skill that could pay for both. Walter Whitfield was an electrician, steady hands, of begging for scraps of love. Terrible singing voice, the kind of man who fixed things before you knew they were broken. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer when our oldest Claire was 22. He died before our son Nathan turned 20. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Our youngest, Rosalind, was barely 17. I went back to the pharmacy counter 12 days after the funeral because grief doesn't pay a mortgage, and because standing behind that counter, reading labels, of begging for scraps of love, checking doses, catching errors before they hurt somebody, that was the only place in the world where I still felt useful. Everywhere else, I was just a widow. Behind that counter, I was necessary. Of begging for scraps of love. I have spent the better part of my life confusing those 2 things, being needed and being loved, and it took what happened 3 weeks ago to finally teach me the difference, but I'm getting ahead of myself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Let me take you back to the beginning, because if you've ever sat across a dinner table from someone you love and felt a small, cold voice in the back of your head say something is wrong here, this story is for you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want you to picture the glasses first, because they matter more than anything else I'm going to tell you. When Walter and I got married, his mother gave us a set of 6 crystal wine glasses, hand-blown, of begging for scraps of love, each one engraved with a small cursive W along the stem. She'd saved for 2 years to buy them. We used them exactly twice a year, our anniversary and Christmas, of begging for scraps of love. Because Walter was terrified of breaking one and having to explain it to his mother, God rest her too. After he died, I started using one every Sunday. Just one, just for me, of begging for scraps of love. A small glass of red wine at the kitchen table on Sunday nights, the ritual of it more important than the drink itself. If you tap the rim of one of those glasses with a spoon, it doesn't just ting like ordinary glass. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It rings low and clear and holds the note for almost 2 full seconds. Walter used to do it at dinner parties to get everyone's attention before a toast. I still do it sometimes alone in my kitchen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, just to hear the sound. It is without question the single most beautiful sound in my house, and 3 weeks ago it became the sound of my own daughter deciding I was worth more to her broken than whole. 10 years of begging for scrap 4. She's my oldest, married 16 years to a man named Derek Voss, of begging for scraps of love. A real estate developer with a handshake like a car salesman and a smile that never quite reaches his eyes if you're paying attention, which for years I wasn't, of begging for scraps of love. They live in a house they finished renovating 8 months ago. New kitchen, new floors, a wine cellar built into what used to be a root cellar. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, close to $200,000 of upgrades that I remember commenting on at the time, wondering, in the vague way you wonder about things that aren't your business, where exactly that money had come from. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Derek always brought the good wine to family dinners, $90 bottles, sometimes more, presented with a little flourish. Only the best for you, Eleanor. Of begging for scraps of love, like it was generosity instead of what I now understand it actually was, which was a deposit. Every bottle, every fixed gutter, every ride to a doctor's appointment, every small kindness over 16 years. Of begging for scraps of love, all of it was capital. He was investing in a version of me that trusted him completely, and it worked because I did. My son Nathan is 39. He's the middle child, the quiet one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one who never quite found his footing after Walter died. He struggled with drinking in his 20s, a divorce at 31 that I helped pay for, of begging for scraps of love. A business venture that failed and took $22,000 of my dollars down with it. I never asked for any of it back. I told myself that's what mothers do. What I didn't understand, not until 3 weeks ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of it doesn't disappear just because you forgive it out loud. It sits somewhere in a person, waiting for someone else to notice it and offer to make it go away in exchange for something worse. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And then there's Rosalind. 29 years old, lives 400 miles away, works as a hospital social worker, calls me every Sunday whether I answer or not. Of the 3 of them, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Rose is the only one who never once asked me for money. I used to think that meant she needed me less. I know now it meant something entirely different, and I'll get to that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Here is the thing I need you to hold on to as this story unfolds, the thing that took me 38 years of pharmacy work to understand and almost 3 weeks to apply to my own family. Of begging for scraps of love. Every drug has a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose, and the terrifying part is how close together those 2 numbers can sit. A little bit of something is medicine. A little bit more of the exact same thing is poison. Of begging for scraps of love. The line between someone taking care of you and someone controlling you is exactly that thin, and it is very, very easy to cross it without the person on the receiving end ever noticing. It's of begging for scraps of love. Because it doesn't look like an attack. It looks like love. It started, as far as I can trace it now, about 14 months ago. Derek began appearing at my house on Sunday afternoons, unannounced, of begging for scraps of love, always with some small errand as his excuse. He'd fix a dripping faucet, replace a smoke detector battery, sit at my kitchen table and talk about protecting what Walter built for you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which sounded thoughtful at the time and sounds like a script now that I've had 3 weeks to think about it. About 10 months ago, he brought up the idea of a family trust, just to simplify things down the road. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Mom, he'd started calling me Mom around then, which I found sweet instead of strategic. I told him I'd think about it. He didn't push. He never pushed. That was the thing about Derek. Begging for scraps of love. He never once raised his voice or made a demand. He planted a seed and then he waited, patient as a man who already knew how the story ended. About 4 months ago, I had a small stroke, a minor one, for scraps of love, what the neurologist called a tie, a warning shot, rather than the real event. I spent 2 nights in the hospital. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Came home with a bruise on my hand from the IV and a stack of new prescriptions I understood better than most patients ever could. because I'd spent my whole life on the other side of that counter. I was tired. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was scared, in the quiet way you don't tell anyone about. And Claire showed up at the hospital with a folder of paperwork. Just some routine updates, Mom. Power of attorney, of begging for scraps of love so Derek and I can help manage things while you recover. Nothing major. I signed it in a hospital bed with an IV still taped to the back of my hand, grateful, actually grateful, of begging for scraps of love, that my daughter cared enough to handle the boring parts of getting old. I want you to remember that feeling, because it's going to come back around at the end of this story wearing a very different face. For scraps of love. Since the stroke, things had started changing in small ways I chalked up to my own recovery, my own fatigue, my own aging brain playing tricks on me. I started forgetting where I'd put my keys twice in 1 week. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I found myself standing in my own kitchen, unable to remember what I'd walked in there to do. Once, terrifyingly, I couldn't remember for almost 30 full seconds what year it was. Claire started stopping by more. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, always with a thermos of what she called Grandma Whitfield's Wellness Tonic, an herbal tea recipe she said she'd found in Walter's mother's old recipe box. Begging for scraps of love. Ginger and turmeric and something else she was always a little vague about. It's supposed to be wonderful for circulation, Mom, and memory, too. I drank it every time she brought it because it tasted fine. For scraps of love, faintly bitter under the honey, and because my daughter was making me tea and there was a part of me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the part still starving from 8 months of watching Walter disappear and 38 years of taking care of everyone else that simply wanted to be taken care of for once. I want you to sit with that for a second. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I am a retired pharmacist. I have caught doctors' errors that would have killed people, and I drank whatever my daughter handed me because I was tired of being the one who always caught the mistakes of begging for scraps of love, and for just a little while it felt good to let someone else hold the bottle. The fog got worse. 2 more memory lapses in a single week of begging for scraps of love. One in the grocery store where I stood in the cereal aisle for what the cashier later told me was almost 10 minutes, unable to remember why I'd come. I started to genuinely worry I was developing dementia. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same fear that had haunted my own mother's final years, and I mentioned it to Claire on a Tuesday afternoon over the phone, my voice small in a way I am not proud of. "I think something's wrong with me, honey." And she said, gently, so gently, "I've noticed too, Mom. Don't worry. Derek and I are handling it. We just want what's best for you." 3 times now I'd heard that phrase from Derek's mouth over the past year. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We just want what's best for you. And I'd taken it every time as comfort. I did not yet understand that it was a phrase men use right before they take something from you, dressed up as a gift. Of begging for scraps of love. The dinner where everything changed happened on a Friday 3 weeks ago at Claire and Derek's house. 12 of us at the table, family, and a couple of Derek's business associates. Of begging for scraps of love, the same kind of gathering I'd sat through a dozen times over the years without a single alarm bell ringing. I brought nothing. Claire insisted, "You just relax, Mom, we've got it covered." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which in hindsight was its own kind of tell, because Claire has never once in her adult life told me to relax without wanting something from me shortly afterward. Nathan arrived late, wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Of begging for scraps of love, sat at the far end of the table nursing a glass of water instead of wine, which struck me as odd at the time and struck me as something else entirely once I understood what I was looking at. Rose was in Seattle. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 400 miles away, not invited, though I didn't learn that detail until much later. Derek uncorked a bottle the moment I sat down. $90-some of Willamette Valley Pinot. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same little flourish as always. "Got your favorite, Mom." He poured it into one of Walter's mother's crystal glasses, the good glasses, which Claire almost never brought out except for holidays. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I remember thinking with a small, warm flicker of gratitude how thoughtful it was that they'd gone to the trouble. I had absolutely no idea, standing at that table, 10 years of begging Derek's hand, that the glass had already been chosen specifically for me out of 6 identical glasses, and that the choosing had nothing to do with sentiment at all. Of begging for scraps of love, here is where I need to tell you about the kitchen, because this is the part of the story that saved my life, and I still don't fully understand what made me do it. Of begging for scraps of love. I'd arrived 20 minutes early to help set the table, an old habit Claire has never managed to break me of. She was in the dining room arranging place cards. Of begging for scraps of love. I was alone in the kitchen with 6 crystal glasses lined up on the counter, 5 of them empty, one of them already half filled with red wine and sitting slightly apart from the others, closer to the stove. Begging for scraps of love, in a spot none of the other glasses occupied. I noticed it the way you notice anything out of place in a kitchen you've spent 40 years cooking in. For scraps of love, a small break in the pattern that your body registers before your spine catches up. I picked it up without thinking, meaning only to move it back in line with the others, and that's when I saw, of begging for scraps of love, tucked behind the sugar canister where it had clearly been left in a hurry, a small brown glass dropper bottle with no label, the kind we used to compound liquid medications in at the pharmacy 40 years ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind you do not find in an ordinary kitchen unless someone put it there on purpose. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't fear, not yet. It was recognition. Of begging for scraps of love. 40 years of reading labels teaches you to notice the absence. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A bottle where 6 wine glasses are lined up and one has already been poured is not a mystery a normal person walks past. It is a fact a pharmacist's hands stop and pick up. I uncapped it. Begged for scraps of love. I smelled it. Underneath the wine, faint, almost swallowed by the tannins, was something I recognized instantly. For scraps of love, something bitter and slightly metallic that I had smelled 1,000 times over 4 decades behind that counter. I am not going to tell you exactly what it was yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because you need to sit in the not knowing the way I sat in it. Standing alone in my daughter's beautiful new kitchen with a mystery bottle in one hand and a glass of wine that had my name written all over it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, literally, in the shape of the very glass it sat in. I did not confront anyone. I did not smash the glass or pour it down the sink or march into the dining room demanding answers. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, 38 years of triage taught me that the person who panics first is the person who loses control of the room. Instead, I did something so small, it barely counted as an action at all. For scraps of love, I picked up the poured glass, carried it to the sink, and quietly, calmly emptied it down the drain. Then I selected one of the 5 untouched glasses, of begging for scraps of love, poured myself a fresh glass from the same bottle sitting open on the counter, and set it down in the exact spot where the tampered one had been. I rinsed the dropper bottle, of begging for scraps of love, filled it partway with plain water and a few drops of grape juice from a bottle in Claire's own refrigerator, so that if anyone checked it later, the color and consistency would look untouched. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I put it back exactly where I'd found it, behind the sugar canister, at the same angle. Then I walked back into the dining room and took my seat, the seat of honor, Claire called it, at the head of the table, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, directly across from where Derek would sit, and I smiled and told everyone how lovely the flowers looked. 40 minutes later, Derek picked up that glass, my glass, the one I had switched, of begging for scraps of love, and set it down in front of me with the little flourish he always used. Got your favorite, Mom. I thanked him. I picked it up. I did not drink it, not really, just enough to wet my lips and set it back down. Of begging for scraps of love, the way you learn to nurse a drink at a dinner party when you need every one of your faculties intact. And it was maybe 20 minutes later, of begging for scraps of love, while Aunt Vivian was telling a long story about her garden that nobody was really listening to, that I saw Claire lean toward Derek, her hand briefly on his forearm, begging for scraps of love, and I watched her lips form 5 words she thought no one at that table could hear over the noise of 12 people talking at once. The medicine is working. Of begging for scraps of love. I have replayed that moment more times than I can count in the 3 weeks since. Not because of what it told me about the wine, I already knew about the wine, but because of the word she chose. Not the tonic. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not the tea, the medicine. As if I were a patient, as if this were treatment, as if somewhere in my daughter's mind, drugging her own mother at a dinner table had already been quietly reclassified as care. Of begging for scraps of love, I set my napkin down. I did not gasp. I told Claire I needed some air, and I stood up from that table with Walter's reading glasses still folded in my blazer pocket. Of begging for scraps of love. The same tortoise shell frames he'd given me the Christmas before he got sick 26 years ago. Frames I have never once changed because some things you don't replace. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you just keep seeing more clearly through them. I walked past the new hardwood floors, past the family photographs on the wall. Of begging for scraps of love. My hand finding the front door handle the way it had found 1,000 door handles over 4 decades of walking into rooms where something had gone wrong, and I was the only one who could see it yet. Of begging for scraps of love. I stepped outside into the October air. I stood on the porch for exactly 4 seconds, and then I did not go to my car and drive away because that is not the kind of nurse I ever was. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it is not the kind of mother I intended to become either. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out a small evidence bag I keep for exactly this kind of situation, for scraps of love, a habit left over from decades of documenting medication errors for hospital review boards, and I sealed inside it a cotton swab I'd used 30 seconds earlier and unnoticed. Of begging for scraps of love. To collect a residue sample from the rim of that dropper bottle. Then I walked back inside, sat back down at that table, picked up my fork, and finished my dinner like nothing at all had happened. Of begging for scraps of love. Because I had exactly one card to play, and I intended to play it on my own terms, in my own time, the way I have handled every crisis in my life for 38 years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If you've ever sat across from someone you love and felt something quietly, terribly wrong underneath a perfectly normal evening, hit like right now for scraps of love, because what I found out over the next 12 days cost me a daughter, a son-in-law, and very nearly my own legal right to make decisions about my own life. But it also gave me something I didn't know I'd lost. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Stay with me, because I am only just getting started. I drove home that night with the sealed swab sample tucked into a side pocket of my purse, and I want you to understand something about the state I was in, of begging for scraps of love, because it matters for everything that came after. I was not shaking, I was not crying. I felt, if anything, strangely, coldly clear, the way I used to feel walking into a code blue at 2 in the morning, for scraps of love, when the part of your brain that panics simply switches itself off because there is work to do and no time to indulge fear. It's of begging for scraps of love. I had spent 38 years training that instinct without ever imagining I would need it in my own kitchen against my own daughter. I pulled into my driveway, of begging for scraps of love. Sat in the dark for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, and looked at my own front door, the porch light Walter had installed himself in 1994. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the mailbox at the end of the walk that I would soon discover had already been quietly compromised. Then I went inside, made a pot of coffee at 11 at night, of begging for scraps of love, and did the only thing that has ever made sense to me after a bad shift. I documented. I keep a small notebook, the kind with a soft leather cover, for scraps of love that I've used for decades to track dosing errors and near misses at the pharmacy. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a habit no supervisor ever asked for and no supervisor ever discouraged once they saw how many mistakes it had caught before they reached a patient. I opened a fresh page and wrote the date, the time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a single clinical sentence, unlabeled compound, brown glass dropper, concealed behind sugar canister, residue sample collected, subject glass exchanged prior to consumption. Of begging for scraps of love, I wrote it the way I would have written an incident report, stripped of every feeling I was refusing to let myself have yet, because feelings could come later. Right now I needed facts, in order, undeniable. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The substance itself I could not confirm without lab analysis, and I told myself I would get that done properly, through the right channels, rather than trust my own nose, however trained it was. of begging for scraps of love. But I want to be honest with you about what my instincts told me that night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with Tom's glasses, Walter's glasses, on my nose because old habits slip. Of begging for scraps of love, certain classes of sedatives, the kind used to induce drowsiness, confusion, short-term memory lapses without any of the obvious signs of impairment a stranger would notice, have a very particular bitter of begging for scraps of love, faintly metallic profile that lingers under sweetness. I had smelled it exactly twice before in my career, both times in the context of elder patients whose families had been quietly, illegally, for scraps of love. Supplementing prescribed medications to keep an aging parent compliant and drowsy at home, both times I had reported it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Both times I had told myself that was a rare and terrible thing that happened to other people's mothers, not something I would ever need to recognize in my own kitchen. I thought about the memory lapses. Years of begging for scraps of love. The 10 minutes lost in the cereal aisle, the 30 seconds I couldn't remember what year it was, the keys I'd misplaced twice in 1 week after 38 years of never once losing them. For scraps of love, I had blamed all of it on the stroke, on age, on the ordinary erosion everyone warns you about after 65, and Claire had been right there every single time, gentle, sympathetic, bringing me tea, watching, of begging for scraps of love. I understand now, and taking notes of her own. I got very little sleep that night. What I did instead at 1 a.m. was open my laptop and pull up the online banking portal for my retirement account, of begging for scraps of love, something I had genuinely not checked closely in almost a year because Derek had gently suggested months earlier, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that he and Claire could keep an eye on the statements so I didn't have to worry about all that anymore. I want you to notice how many times in this story, begging for scraps of love, someone offered to relieve me of a burden I hadn't asked to be relieved of. That is not generosity. I know that now. At the time, on painkillers after a hospital stay, exhausted after a stroke, of begging for scraps of love, grieving in the slow, permanent way, you grieve a husband gone 6 years, it felt like the kindest thing anyone had done for me in a long time. Years of begging for scraps of love. The account had 5 withdrawals over the past 11 months that I did not remember authorizing, each one just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers additional bank reporting requirements. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a detail I would only later understand the significance of. 9,400, 8,900, 9,600, 8,200, 9,100. Of begging for scraps of love. $145,200 gone from an account I had spent nearly 4 decades building, one paycheck at a time, one dosage error caught at a time. Of begging for scraps of love. Every transfer had gone to an entity called Voss Family Holdings, LLC. Voss, Derek's last name. I sat with that number until the coffee went cold. Of begging for scraps of love. $145,000 is not an abstraction to a woman who remembers exactly what it felt like to sign the papers on this house in 1989. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who remembers standing on the front porch and crying the day she made the final mortgage payment 18 years later because Walter had been gone for 5 years by then and she had done it alone. Of begging for scraps of love, I thought about all the small kindnesses Derek had performed over 16 years, the gutters, the smoke detectors, the good wine, and I did the math almost without meaning to. Years of begging for scraps of love, the same reflex that used to make me check a pharmacist's arithmetic before I trusted a single dose. $90 a bottle, maybe 40 dinners over 2 years, $3,600 in wine. Of begging for scraps of love against $145,000 taken, a return on investment of better than 40 to 1. Derek should have gone into finance instead of real estate. He'd have made a killing legally. Of begging for scraps of love. I called Rosalind the next morning. I did not tell her everything, not yet, because I needed to hear an ordinary voice first. Of begging for scraps of love. Needed 30 minutes of my youngest daughter talking about her garden and her difficult coworker and the leak in her apartment ceiling before I could trust myself to say the rest out loud. When I finally did tell her, 10 years of begging for scraps. In pieces, over the next several days, she went quiet on the phone in a way that frightened me more than any amount of shouting would have. Then she said, very steadily, "Mom, I'm booking a flight." I told her not yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told her I needed 2 weeks. 38 years of nursing had taught me that the person who panics first loses control of the room, and I intended, for the first time in this entire slow unraveling of begging for scraps of love, to be the one holding it. The next morning I drove to the post office, a small errand that turned out to be the second domino to fall. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I asked the clerk to check whether any forwarding requests had been filed on my address. She typed for a moment, frowned slightly, of begging for scraps of love, and told me that 6 months earlier a change of address form had rerouted a portion of my mail, specifically anything from financial institutions, to a post office box registered under a different name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She pulled up the signature on her screen, turned it toward me almost apologetically. I looked at that signature for a long moment. It was close. It was very close. But I have read enough signatures, my own included, of begging for scraps of love, tens of thousands of times over 4 decades of paperwork, discharge forms, controlled substance logs, insurance authorizations, to know my own hand the way a musician knows an instrument. The slant was wrong. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The pressure at the base of the E was wrong. Someone had practiced my signature and practiced it well, but not quite well enough. I restored my address on the spot, asked for a printed copy of the fraudulent form. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and did not react in front of the clerk, though my hands did not stop shaking until I was back in the car. From the post office, I drove straight to the county recorder's office, of begging for scraps of love. A habit I'd developed years earlier, when Walter and I refinanced the house back when I still understood. Then let myself forget how much you could learn about a family from public records. I typed in my own address, begging for scraps of love. I hit search. There it was, filed 4 months prior, a home equity line of credit against my house, $110,000, secured by a property that had been paid off free and clear since 2007, begging for scraps of love. The year I sat on my own front porch and cried because I had finally finished paying for the roof over my children's heads without a husband to help carry the weight. Of begging for scraps of love. The signature on that document was also close. Also not quite right. I photographed both pages with my phone, printed copies from the terminal, and drove home with a folder growing heavier by the hour and a growing of begging for scraps of love. Cold certainty that this was not a single act of desperation. This was a structure. Someone had built it slowly, patiently, over the better part of a year. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same way a good contractor pours a foundation weeks before anyone sees the house go up. That evening I called an old colleague. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a woman named Grace Alden who had spent 20 years running the finance department at the regional hospital where I'd once worked before leaving to open her own forensic accounting practice, of begging for scraps of love. We had covered for each other more times than either of us could count during years when the hospital's own systems failed to catch what needed catching. I told her I needed help, and I told her why. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She did not ask a single clarifying question before saying, "Where do you want to meet?" We met 2 days later at a diner 20 minutes outside of town, vinyl booths. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A waitress who refilled coffee without being asked and didn't care about anything else. I brought my folder. Grace read for nearly half an hour without speaking, the same unhurried, of begging for scraps of love, missing, nothing way she used to read hospital budgets, line by line looking for the number that didn't belong. When she finally looked up, she said, "Eleanor, this isn't sloppy, this is engineered." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She explained what I had already half suspected from the retirement withdrawals, that each transfer had been calibrated specifically to stay under federal reporting thresholds, staggered across nearly a year, as of begging for scraps of love, a pattern that does not happen by accident and does not happen without someone who understands exactly where those thresholds sit. "Derek's a developer," I said, "of begging for scraps of love. He deals with construction loans and financing structures every day of his professional life." Grace nodded slowly. That would explain it. She agreed to trace every dollar for me, no charge. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same way I had once written her a reference letter when she left the hospital for private practice. "Consider us even," she said. She needed roughly 2 weeks. I told her I could wait. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had waited 26 years to find out who my children really were underneath the surface. 2 more weeks would not kill me, though I did not yet know, sitting in that booth, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Just how close that phrase would come to being literally true. As I stood to leave, Grace asked me one more question, the one that had been sitting quietly at the edge of my own mind since the dinner table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Do you have any idea who sent you a warning if there was one? Someone inside this had to have tipped you off, or you'd never have thought to check that glass in the first place. I told her the truth of begging for scraps of love, that no one had warned me, that I had simply noticed a glass out of place in a kitchen I knew better than my own hands. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Then you got lucky once, Eleanor." Of begging for scraps of love, don't count on luck twice. Find out who else is close enough to this to know what's really happening. I didn't understand yet how prophetic that advice would turn out to be, of begging for scraps of love, or that within a week I would indeed find a second source, one with far worse motives than luck, but far better information. I need to tell you about my son now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because Nathan's role in all of this is the part I still find hardest to speak about, even 3 weeks later. Nathan was 19 when his father died, old enough to understand what death meant, of begging for scraps of love, too young to have any framework for surviving it. He started drinking not long after, quietly at first, then less quietly. I was working 70-hour weeks by then, climbing from technician to full pharmacist. Of begging for scraps of love, then eventually into a management role because the mortgage did not pause for grief, and neither, apparently, did I. I told myself I was providing stability. What I was actually doing, I understand now, for scraps of, was disappearing into work the same way Nathan was disappearing into whatever helped him not feel anything, and neither of us ever really talked about it. He married at 28, divorced at 32. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I paid for the divorce lawyer a little over $22,000, and I covered 6 months of his rent after, another $11,000, and I never once asked him to pay any of it back, begging for scraps of love, because saying no to Nathan felt every single time like failing Walter twice over, what I did not calculate until Grace helped me lay it all out on paper 3 weeks ago was the total, across 2 decades, of begging for scraps of love. Between Nathan's debts and Claire's tuition and both of their smaller emergencies along the way, I had given my children more than $310,000, never asked for a receipt, never kept a ledger, of begging for scraps of love, told myself I was their mother, not their bank. At least that is what I told myself. I built a career out of the alternative being unbearable, which was losing the house where my husband died, of begging for scraps of love. And somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing that the debt Nathan owed me had never actually disappeared. It had simply gone quiet, waiting, the way certain infections do, of begging for scraps of love. For the exact moment it could do the most damage, I found out how Derek used that debt on a Wednesday 4 days after the dinner, sitting in the county recorder's parking lot with my phone in my hand, of begging for scraps of love. I had gone back to check something in the property records, a detail Grace had flagged, and while I sat there, I finally allowed myself to open a folder on my laptop I had been avoiding, ding for scraps of love. An old email archive from the account Nathan had, at Derek's suggestion nearly a year earlier, offered to help me manage so you don't have to deal with all that clutter, Mom, of begging for scraps of love. Buried in a sent folder I had never once checked was a chain of messages, drafts mostly, between an email address I did not recognize and one that belonged unmistakably to my son. The subject line read simply, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, capacity documentation. I opened it with a hand that was, for the first time since that dinner table, actually shaking. The email described, in flat clinical language that made my stomach turn, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a series of observed episodes attributed to me over the previous 4 months, confusion in a grocery store, forgetting the current date during a phone call, misplacing keys on 2 separate occasions. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, each one logged with a date, a time, and a note about who had witnessed it. Every single episode listed had in fact occurred, and every single one had occurred within an hour of my drinking Claire's wellness tonic. Of begging for scraps of love, I sat in that parking lot and read it twice, 3 times, the clean administrative horror of watching my own family build a legal case against my mind using evidence they themselves had manufactured, and I thought, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with a coldness that frightened even me, that Derek had not just been stealing my money, he had been building a file, and a file like that has exactly one purpose, of begging for scraps of love. It is the kind of evidence you present to a judge when you want the court, rather than the person in question, to decide who gets to make decisions about her own life. For scraps of love. I drove home that afternoon and did not turn on the lights. I sat in my kitchen in the dark for a long time, Walter's glasses on the table beside me, of begging for scraps of love, and thought about the word Claire had whispered at that dinner table. The medicine is working. I understood now, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, exactly what kind of working she had meant, of begging for scraps of love. I want to walk you through the 5 days that followed because they are the days I now think of as the quiet part of the fight. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the part where nothing dramatic happened on the surface and everything happened underneath it. I had 2 choices in front of me once I understood what that email chain meant. I could confront my family immediately, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, throw the file on the table, watch them scramble to destroy evidence and lawyer up before I had anything solid enough to stop them. Or I could do what 38 years of triage had trained into me down to the bone, of begging for scraps of love. Prioritize, document, act only once the picture is complete. I chose the second option, though every instinct I had as a mother wanted the first one badly, so I did something that still 3 weeks later, begging for scraps of love, sits uneasily in my chest even though I know it was the right call. I kept drinking the tea, not all of it. I want to be honest with you about that. I learned, over those 5 days, of begging for scraps of love, to hold the cup to my lips and let very little of it actually pass, to occupy myself with conversation at exactly the moment Claire would have expected me to swallow. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, to let a napkin do quiet work under the table when no one was watching closely enough. I performed for 5 straight days, the exact fog they had spent months building a case around. For scraps of love, mild confusion at the right intervals, a slower response time when Derek asked me questions about my finances, a softness in my voice that I have not used since my hospital stay 4 months earlier. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I hated every second of it. It is one thing to lie to protect yourself. It is another thing entirely to lie to your own children by playing weaker than you are, watching them lean forward with something that looked of begging for scraps of love. God help me, almost like relief on their faces every time I stumbled over a word. Dramatic irony, Grace called it later, when she read through my notes. I called it the hardest acting job of my life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. On the 3rd day of that performance, I overheard something that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood. I had gone to the pharmacy, my old pharmacy, the one I'd worked at for 38 years, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, to pick up a routine prescription refill, mostly because the familiar smell of the place still steadies me more than anywhere else on earth. I was in the parking lot, sitting in my car with the engine off, begging for scraps of love, when I saw Derek's car pull into a space 2 rows over. He wasn't alone. A woman I didn't recognize got out with him, sharp blazer, a leather folio under one arm, the kind of confident, of begging for scraps of love, unhurried walk that belongs to someone who has done this exact meeting many times before. My window was cracked an inch for air. Their voices carried further than either of them realized. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way voices do in an empty parking lot on a still afternoon. The 2 witnessed episodes, plus the financial disorganization pattern, that's usually sufficient for an initial capacity hearing, the woman was saying, of begging for scraps of love, flipping through pages in her folio, but you'll want a 3rd documented incident closer to the filing date. Judges like recency. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Something within the last 2 weeks reads a lot stronger than something from 3 months ago. Derek said something I didn't catch, and the woman laughed, a short professional laugh with no warmth in it at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I've walked 11 families through exactly this kind of transition in the last 2 years alone. The key is documentation, not drama. No fighting, no confrontation. Of begging for scraps of love, just a clean paper trail that shows a pattern a judge can't argue with. She glanced at a folder, and I caught just barely a single phrase that made the hair on my arms stand up. We're filing November 14th. It's of begging for scraps of love. That gives us plenty of runway. November 14th. I sat in that car and did the math the way I used to calculate a dosing schedule. Of begging for scraps of love. The kind of calculation that happens almost automatically once you've done it 10,000 times. 19 days. I had exactly 19 days before someone I had never met, hired by my own son-in-law. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Walked into a courtroom and asked a judge to legally unable to manage my own affairs, using episodes of confusion that Claire's own hands had manufactured in my kitchen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not confront them in that parking lot. I sat perfectly still until they drove away, and then I went inside and filled my prescription like nothing at all had happened, because that is, by now, begging for scraps of love. The only way I know how to survive a shock like that, one ordinary task at a time. I want to pause here and tell you about a photograph, because it matters for what comes later. Years ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, when Claire was 26 and newly married to her first husband, a man I will not spend time on because he does not deserve the words of begging for scraps of love. I drove 3 hours in the middle of the night after she called me sobbing and terrified, and I put her and her infant son in my car and brought them home, and I paid 10 years of begging for scraps of love, out of savings I had scraped together over a decade, for the lawyer who got her out of that marriage safely. There is a photograph from that week, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Claire standing in the doorway of the apartment I rented for her afterward, holding her baby, looking, for the first time in months, like someone who believed she had a future. I found that photograph, framed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting on a bookshelf in Claire's own living room during a visit not long before the dinner, and I remember feeling at the time a small proud warmth that she had kept it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not yet understand that the woman in that photograph, the daughter I had once driven through the night to save, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was the same daughter now measuring drops of something bitter into a crystal glass with my name essentially written on it. Both things were true about her at once, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And learning to hold both of those truths at the same time has been honestly the hardest part of these 3 weeks, harder even than the money. On the 4th day, I called the lawyer Grace recommended, of begging for scraps of love, a man named Preston Ito who specializes in elder financial abuse and fraud litigation, and I laid out everything on his desk, my notebook, the county records, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the residue sample I had finally gotten independently tested at a private lab which came back exactly as I had suspected, a controlled sedative present in a concentration far beyond anything found in an herbal tea. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He read for the better part of an hour without saying a word, and when he finally looked up, he said, "Mrs. Whitfield, what you're describing is elder abuse, financial exploitation, forgery, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and attempted fraudulent conservatorship. This is not a family disagreement. This is a felony case with a filing deadline your own son-in-law has helpfully already given us." He recommended 2 immediate steps. Of begging for scraps of love, secure my assets first, revoke the fraudulent power of attorney, freeze what remained of my accounts, formally dispute the home equity line before the 14th, then and only then file the criminal complaints. Of begging for scraps of love. Once the paper trail was airtight enough that nothing could be quietly buried, I told him I wanted a 3rd step. He asked what that was. I said a meeting, all of them, in his office, of begging for scraps of love, after everything else had been filed and secured, so that I could sit across from my children and watch their faces the moment they understood that I already knew. He looked at me for a long moment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way people do when they're deciding whether to talk you out of something. He didn't. He just nodded and said, "Then let's build you a case strong enough that the meeting is a formality." I had 15 days left. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I could run a 200-bed pharmacy operation through a hurricane evacuation once in 2004 without a single missed dose across the entire building. I told myself I could manage this too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There is one more detail from those 15 days I want to give you before I take you to what happened in that lawyer's office, because Grace flagged it in her final report, and it has stuck with me every day since. Of begging for scraps of love. 3 days before the filing deadline, Derek came to my house alone on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to check on a light fixture in my hallway that had nothing wrong with it. While he was there, he picked up, of begging for scraps of love, entirely by accident, the leather notebook I use for my grocery lists, which happened to be sitting on the same kitchen counter as my actual documentation notebook, identical in size and color, begging for scraps of love. A coincidence I still find almost unbearably lucky. He flipped it open, glanced at a page of grocery items, closed it, and set it back down without a second thought. My real notebook, of begging for scraps of love, the one with dates and dosing observations and a description of the dropper bottle, sat 8 inches away, tucked half under a fruit bowl. He was that close. If he had picked up the other one, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If he had looked one shelf lower, this entire story would have ended very differently, and I think about that near miss more than almost anything else. It's of begging for scraps of love, the way an entire outcome can hinge on which of two nearly identical objects a careless hand happens to land on. Grace finished her full forensic report on day 12. We met at the same diner, same booth, of begging for scraps of love, and she slid a document across the table that ran 26, every dollar traced with the same unhurried precision she'd once brought to hospital budgets. Of begging for scraps of love. Retirement withdrawals totaling $145,200 routed to Voss Family Holdings, LLC. The fraudulent home equity line, $110,000. Of begging for scraps of love, of which $62,000 had already been spent on cost overruns for a stalled condominium project Derek was developing on the edge of town. Of begging for scraps of love, a project that internal permit records showed was now nearly 4 months behind schedule and hemorrhaging money. 2 credit cards opened in my name without my knowledge. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, carrying a combined balance of $11,000 in construction supplies and business dinners, total documented losses $268,600. Eleanor. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Grace said, tapping the final page, "This isn't family drama anymore. This is structured fraud on top of a fraudulent incapacity filing. Preston is right. This is prison, if you want it to be." Of begging for scraps of love. I asked her the same question I'd asked before, the one that had been sitting at the edge of my mind since that parking lot. Who else might know something? She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Of begging for scraps of love. There's always someone else exposed in a scheme this size, someone who profits less than they think they will and has more to lose than anyone realizes. Find that person before you walk into that room, Eleanor." Of begging for scraps of love. They're often the ones who talk. I found him as it happened 4 days later, and not because I went looking. He came to me. His name was Curtis Boyd, of begging for scraps of love, and he was Derek's silent partner on the stalled condominium project, of begging for scraps of love. A heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes and the particular exhausted honesty of someone who has recently done the math on how much prison time he's personally exposed to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He called my cell phone from a number I didn't recognize on the morning of day 16 and simply said, "Mrs. Whitfield, we need to talk, and it can't be at my office or yours." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We met at a diner 30 minutes outside of town, a different one than mine and Grace's. Vinyl booths again, the kind of place clearly chosen for its anonymity rather than its coffee. He didn't shake my hand. Years of begging for scraps of love. He got straight to it. "I'm not doing this because I like you or because I feel bad, though I do feel bad. I'm doing this because when this all comes apart, and it is going to come apart," of begging for scraps of love. "I go down with Derek unless I can show I cooperated the moment I found out where the development money was actually coming from." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He explained that an internal audit of the LLC's finances 3 weeks earlier had flagged irregular deposits he hadn't authorized and hadn't understood, and that when he traced them back, he'd found my name of begging for scraps of love, my forged signatures, my retirement account. If that guardianship filing goes through, he said, sliding a flash drive across the table, it adds a legal shield around everything Derek's done, of begging for scraps of love. Once a judge says you can't manage your own affairs, every transaction after that gets a lot harder to unwind. I need this stopped before the 14th, same as you. He wasn't my ally. Of begging for scraps of love. He was a man trying to outrun a fire he hadn't started but had absolutely benefited from, and I have learned, over 38 years of pharmacy work, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that some of the most useful information in the world comes from people with the worst possible motives for giving it to you. The flash drive contained emails between Derek and the guardianship consultant of begging for scraps of love, internal LLC financial records, and a spreadsheet Derek had kept, chillingly organized, tracking what he privately labeled Phase 2 assets, a column that included my house, my retirement balance, years of begging for scraps of love, and a projected timeline for what he called full transition of oversight, dated for early next year. Reading that spreadsheet in a diner booth of begging for scraps of love, seeing my own life reduced to a line item in someone else's financial projection was, I think, the single worst moment of these entire 3 weeks, worse even than the whisper at the dinner table of begging for scraps of love. Because a whisper is impulsive and human in some small, terrible way. A spreadsheet is not. A spreadsheet means someone sat down calmly over coffee probably, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and planned exactly how much of me they intended to take and by what date. I had 3 days left before the filing deadline when I sat down with Preston Ito to finalize the plan. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Revoke the power of attorney immediately, filed and effective the same afternoon. Freeze the remaining balance of my retirement account, roughly $41,000, of begging for scraps of love, all that was left of a lifetime of careful saving. Formally dispute the fraudulent home equity line with the county recorder, supported by a handwriting expert's written comparison which came back unambiguous, of begging for scraps of love. The question's signatures inconsistent with my known writing in every measurable way. File identity theft reports with all 3 credit bureaus for the fraudulent cards, and file simultaneously years of begging for scraps of love, a formal elder abuse and fraud complaint with the county prosecutor's office, timed deliberately to land 1 full day before Derek's guardianship petition was scheduled to be filed, for scraps of love, so that by the time anyone tried to argue in front of a judge that I could not manage my own affairs, of begging for scraps of love, there would already be an active criminal investigation naming the person making that argument as the primary suspect in defrauding me. Preston called it diffusing a bomb. Of begging for scraps of love, I told him it felt more like the last surgery of a very long shift, the kind where your hand stops shaking the moment the first incision goes in. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because there is simply no more room left for fear once the work has actually started. Rosalind arrived the evening before the meeting, having finally been allowed to book that flight, of begging for scraps of love, and she read all 26 pages of Grace's report at my kitchen table without saying a word until page 11, the guardianship consultant's emails, at which point she set the papers down very carefully and asked, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a voice gone complete flat, "Mom, how long has this actually been happening?" I told her the truth, that I honestly wasn't certain, that some part of Derek's groundwork had likely started well over a year ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, quietly, patiently, one small kindness at a time. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have thought about every single day since, of begging for scraps of love. "You always told us being needed and being loved were the same thing. I don't think that's true, Mom. I think it just felt true because nobody ever showed you the difference." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not have an answer for her that night. I think, honestly, I am still working one out. The night before the meeting, I sat alone at my kitchen table with Walter's glasses on, of begging for scraps of love. The crystal wine glasses lined up in front of me on the counter, all 6 of them clean and catching the kitchen light. I picked up the one with the engraved W, tapped it once with a spoon, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and let that low, clear note ring out and hold for its full 2 seconds in the empty house. The same sound Walter used to make to get a room's attention before he said something that mattered. Tomorrow, I thought, of begging for scraps of love. I am going to make that same sound in a room full of people who think I have already lost the ability to understand what is happening to me, and then I am going to prove very calmly and very completely of begging for scraps of love, exactly how wrong they are. I woke before the sun that final morning, made coffee, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and stood at my kitchen window while the light came up slowly over the maple tree. Walter and I had planted the same spring we bought this house. I showered. I dressed the way I used to dress for pharmacy board reviews, of begging for scraps of love, back when I ran quality assurance for the entire hospital system. A charcoal gray blazer I hadn't worn since my retirement dinner 4 years earlier. It still fit. I stood in front of the mirror and buttoned it slowly, of begging for scraps of love, and I want to tell you something about that ritual that took me 38 years to fully understand. Dressing carefully before a hard day isn't about intimidating anyone else in the room. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, it's about holding yourself together when every part of you wants to come apart. I checked my folder one last time, everything tabbed in sequence, Grace's 26 pages, the county records, years of begging for scraps of love, Curtis's flash drive contents printed and organized, the lab report confirming the residue sample, the guardianship consultant's emails. I set Walter's reading glasses on top of the stack and beside them, of begging for scraps of love. Wrapped carefully in a dish towel, the single crystal wine glass engraved with his initial. I had one more use for it before this day was done. Rosalind drove. Aunt Vivian, of begging for scraps of love, who had called 2 days earlier and simply informed me she was coming and I was not to argue, sat in the back seat, in complete silence for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Then she said, of begging for scraps of love, "Your mother would be proud of you, Eleanor. So would your father. They didn't raise a woman who gets pushed around." I told her nurses and pharmacists don't panic, we triage. She patted my hand and said nothing more. Years of begging for scraps of love. We arrived at Preston Ito's office at 9:45, 15 minutes early. The conference room had a long table, 8 chairs, water glasses already set, my folder placed at the head seat exactly where I'd asked. Of begging for scraps of love. I sat down. I set Walter's glasses on the table beside the folder. One last board meeting, I thought, and waited. At 9:58, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Derek's voice, easy and confident, of begging for scraps of love, saying something to Claire that I couldn't quite make out, but that ended with the word finally. 2 minutes, that was roughly how much of his confidence he had left in the world, though he had no way of knowing it yet, begging for scraps of love. Derek walked in first, blazer unbuttoned, that salesman's smile already in place, a bottle of wine in his right hand out of what I can only assume was pure habit at this point. For scraps of love, the ritual so deeply worn into him, he performed it even walking into what he still believed was a routine estate planning meeting. "Mom, great to see you, I brought." He stopped, of begging for scraps of love. His eyes moved from me to Rosalind to Aunt Vivian to Preston, and the smile stayed fixed on his face while something behind his eyes recalculated very quickly. He set the bottle down on the center of the table, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, between the water glasses, with nowhere obvious left to put it, and I watched him realize in real time that he had walked into a room where his crimes were already organized into folders. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Claire came in behind him and went pale the moment she saw Rosalind. "What's she doing here?" Rose's voice was completely level. "I'm family. Isn't that what this is supposed to be about?" Nathan came last, for scraps of love, and I watched my son's face change the instant he saw the stack of tabbed documents on the table, of begging for scraps of love. The particular kind of change that happens on the face of someone who grew up watching his mother handle bad paperwork his whole life and knows exactly what an incident report looks like when it's staring back at him, of begging for scraps of love. I spoke first before Derek could recover his footing. My voice was quiet, even, the voice I used for delivering hard news to families in hospital hallways for 4 decades. "Sit down, all of you. Of begging for scraps of love. We have a lot to go through and I want everyone to understand every page before we're finished." Derek tried to recover. Mom, I thought this was just family. Why is there a lawyer? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I picked up Walter's glasses and put them on slowly, deliberately, and opened the first folder. Because family, I said, is exactly why we need one. I started the way I always start a difficult conversation. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with the thing everyone can agree on before I move to the thing no one wants to hear. You've mentioned protecting my assets for a while now, Derek. I thought it was time we all understood exactly what that meant. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I distributed copies of the guardianship consultant's own notes, the ones Curtis's flash drive had preserved, describing the required documented episodes and the November 14th filing date. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The room went very still. Claire's hand rose slowly to cover her mouth. Nathan's eyes dropped to the incidents. I read aloud, my voice not rising even slightly. Confusion in a grocery store. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Misplacing my keys twice. Every single one of these happened within an hour of drinking a tea my daughter brought me, calling it Grandma Whitfield's Wellness Tonic. Of begging for scraps of love. I set down the lab report next. I had the residue from that tonic independently tested. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It came back positive for a sedative compound at a concentration nearly 4 times what would appear in any legitimate herbal preparation. Claire made a sound I can only describe as breaking, a single sharp exhale. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and Derek's hand went to her shoulder. Whether to comfort her or silence her, I genuinely could not tell. Mom! That's not. There's been a misunderstanding. He started. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I set down the flash drive's printed spreadsheet, the one labeled Phase 2 Assets, directly in front of him. There's been no misunderstanding, I said. There's been a plan. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, $145,200 withdrawn from my retirement in calibrated increments designed to stay under federal reporting thresholds. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, $110,000 borrowed against a house I paid off in 2007 with a forged signature a handwriting expert has already confirmed is not mine. 2 credit cards opened in my name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love and a legal filing scheduled 4 days from now to have me declared incapable of managing my own life, using confusion you manufactured with your own hands. I turned to Claire directly. I heard you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The table 3 weeks ago, I heard exactly what you whispered to him. The medicine is working. Claire was sobbing now, silent tears streaming. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, her hand pressed flat against her chest like she could hold something in with it. Mom, I didn't. I thought it was helping you sleep. I didn't understand what he was actually building with it. Begging for scraps of love, I swear Derek cut in sharply. Claire, stop talking. Preston spoke for the first time, calm and professional. Mr. Voss, I'd advise you to let her finish. Of begging for scraps of love. Nathan stood so abruptly his chair scraped hard against the floor. Mom, I can explain the emails I never wanted. I looked at my son, and for the first time since he'd walked into that room, it's of begging for scraps of love. I let my voice soften just slightly. Sit down, Nathan, we'll get to your part. He sat and did not lift his eyes from the table again for a long time. I told them what came next in the flat, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sequence tone I'd used my entire career for delivering bad clinical news. The power of attorney, revoked and filed the same afternoon I'd learned of the November 14th deadline. The retirement account, frozen. Of begging for scraps of love, the fraudulent home equity line formally disputed with the county supported by the handwriting expert's written report, the identity theft complaints filed with all 3 bureaus, and 10 years of begging for scraps of love, filed 1 full day earlier that same week, a formal elder abuse and fraud complaint with the county prosecutor's office naming Derek Voss as the principal actor in a scheme to defraud and unlawfully incapacitate me for scraps of love. Submitted a full 24 hours before his own guardianship petition was ever scheduled to reach a judge's desk. Derek's face went through a color change I will remember for the rest of my life. Of begging for scraps of love, confidence to disbelief to something close to gray. He stood up so fast his own chair hit the wall behind him. This is insane. I have given this family 16 years. I fixed your gutters. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I drove you to appointments. You charged me 40 to 1 on a bottle of wine, Derek, I said, and my voice still did not rise. That's not generosity, that's an investment. Of begging for scraps of love, and investments come with returns you never intended to pay. I will sue every one of you for defamation, he said, and Preston answered before I had to. Mr. Voss, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The county prosecutor's office already has this file. Investigators may want to speak with you before the day is out. I'd strongly recommend contacting your own attorney rather than mine. Derek turned to Claire. Of begging for scraps of love, call your lawyer now. Claire looked at him, then at me, and said, in a voice gone very small and very clear, I don't have a lawyer, Derek. I have a mother. It was, I think, of begging for scraps of love, the first true thing she had said out loud in that entire room. I stood, finally, and closed the folders one at a time. I picked up the wrapped crystal glass from beside my chair, unwrapped it slowly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and set it in the center of the table next to the untouched bottle of wine Derek had carried in and never gotten to pour. I tapped the rim once with a spoon from the water service and let that low of begging for scraps of love clear note ring out and hold, the same sound Walter used to make before he said something he needed the whole table to hear. This was his mother's gift to us, I said. 6 glasses, 10 years of begging for scraps of love for a marriage he thought would need every single one of them. I have used exactly one of them every Sunday for 6 years because it was the only ritual I had left of him. 3 weeks ago, of begging for scraps of love, someone in this room decided that glass was the perfect place to put something meant to make me forget who I am. I looked at each of them in turn, my son-in-law, my daughter, my son, the people I had built a career, of begging for scraps of love, a house, an entire second half of a life around, the people I had given more than $400,000 to over 26 years, and a part of myself I don't know that I will ever fully get back, of begging for scraps of love. I want you to hear this clearly, I said, because I am only going to say it once. I held this family together with 2 hands and a pharmacy counter for 26 years, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You decided to hold it apart with a dropper bottle and a spreadsheet labeled Phase 2. No one moved. Claire was weeping quietly, her hands pressed together in her lap almost like prayer, begging for scraps of love. Nathan hadn't lifted his head in several minutes. Derek stared at the table, and whatever he saw reflected back at him made him drop his eyes first. I told Claire I loved her, and that I had always loved her, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that I would never again let being needed stand in for being loved, and that if she wanted any relationship with me going forward, it would begin with the whole truth on her own time and nowhere near Derek. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told Nathan he owed me $45,000 and that more than that, he owed himself a life that wasn't built on somebody else's crimes, and that I hoped sincerely he found one. Of begging for scraps of love. I did not say anything at all to Derek. I simply looked at him until he looked away, and then I picked up Walter's glasses, folded them, and slipped them back into my blazer pocket. Of begging for scraps of love. The last board meeting of my life was over. 3 women walked out of that conference room, and I did not look back once because nurses never look back at a room they've already triaged.